The wind had always spoken to Arya in voices that others could not hear. As a child growing up in the small Omega settlement nestled between the northern mountains, she would stand at the edge of the cliffs with her arms outstretched, letting the fierce gusts whip through her dark hair while whispers curled around her like invisible threads. The other children thought her strange, touched by madness perhaps, but Arya knew better. The wind was not her enemy but her oldest companion, and it had been telling her the same story for as long as she could remember. It spoke of a king whose heart had turned to stone, of a throne built on the bones of broken promises, of a name that echoed through centuries like a war drum calling her home. Kaelin. The wind breathed that name into her dreams, carved it into her consciousness until she could taste it on her tongue, even though she had never met anyone who bore it. Her grandmother, the only one who never dismissed her claims as childish fantasy, would watch her with knowing eyes that held secrets too heavy for words. Before she died, the old woman had pressed a weathered leather journal into Arya's hands and whispered that some destinies were written in starlight and sealed with ancient blood, that the wind never lied to those brave enough to listen, and that when the time came, Arya would understand why she had been marked by forces older than the kingdoms themselves. 20 years later, Arya stood in the rubble of her destroyed village, ash coating her skin and the metallic taste of blood on her lips as she watched Alpha King Kaelin Stormborn's soldiers drag survivors from their hiding places. The attack had come at dawn, swift and merciless, with warriors bearing the silver wolf insignia of the Northern Kingdom descending upon the settlement like a plague of locusts. The wind had tried to warn her, howling through the night with unusual violence. But Arya had not understood the urgency of its message until she saw the flames consuming the wooden structures that had stood for generations. Now she knelt with her hands bound, surrounded by weeping children and bloodied elders, while a commander with cold gray eyes walked among them, selecting who would live and who would be left to the mercy of the elements. When his gaze fell upon Arya, something flickered in his expression, a recognition that made her skin prickle with unease. He grabbed her chin roughly, tilting her face toward the morning light, and she heard him mutter something about unusual markings before ordering his men to separate her from the others. As they hauled her to her feet, the wind surged around her with such force that several soldiers stumbled backward, and in that moment of chaos, she heard it again. That name whispered with urgency and longing that transcended reason. Kaelin. The man who had ordered this destruction was the one the wind had been preparing her to meet all along. The journey to the capital of the Northern Kingdom took 5 brutal days across frozen wasteland and treacherous mountain passes. Arya was kept separate from the other prisoners, locked in a reinforced wagon that reeked of fear and old blood, with guards who would not meet her eyes but whispered among themselves about Omega prisoners who carried marks of the old magic. She spent the hours tracing the strange silvery patterns that had appeared on her inner wrists the morning of the attack, symbols that seemed to shift and reform when she was not looking directly at them, and listening to the wind as it followed their caravan with relentless persistence. Through its voice, she began to piece together fragments of a story that her rational mind rejected, but her soul recognized as truth. Hundreds of years ago, a powerful Omega sorceress named Ariandel had bound herself to an Alpha King through forbidden blood magic, creating a bond that transcended death itself. When that king betrayed her love and used her power to wage war against neighboring kingdoms, Ariandel had cursed him with immortality of the cruelest kind, forcing his soul to be reborn again and again, always as an Alpha King, always destined to meet her reincarnated soul, and always doomed to lose her unless he could learn what true leadership and love required. The wind told Arya that she was the 7th incarnation of Ariandel, and that the Alpha King Kaelin was the 7th version of the man who had broken the original oath. This cycle had repeated through the centuries, each lifetime ending in tragedy, each death reinforcing the curse, until both souls were so fractured that remembering their true nature seemed impossible. If you are enjoying this story of destiny and ancient magic, please leave a comment below, sharing whether you believe in soulmates that transcend time, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more supernatural romance stories that will captivate your heart and imagination. The Palace of the Northern Kingdom rose from the mountainside like a crown of ice and obsidian, its towers piercing the gray sky with arrogant defiance. Arya was dragged through corridors of polished stone, where torches cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with tapestries depicting brutal conquests and fallen enemies. Servants scurried past without looking at her, their heads bowed in the permanent posture of those who lived under tyranny, and she could smell the fear that permeated every corner of this place like rot beneath perfume. Finally, she was thrown into a great hall where a massive throne carved from a single piece of black volcanic rock dominated the space. And there, seated with the casual arrogance of a man who had never questioned his right to rule, was the Alpha King Cailan Stormborn. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30 in appearance, though his eyes held centuries of weariness that belied his physical form. His dark hair was pulled back severely from a face that would have been beautiful, if not for the cruelty carved into every line, and his body radiated the kind of power that made the air itself seem to bend around him. When those ice-blue eyes locked onto hers, the world tilted on its axis. The wind inside the hall surged with such violence that tapestries ripped from their hangings, and torches guttered and died, plunging them into shadows broken only by the strange luminescence that seemed to emanate from both their bodies. Arya felt the bond snap into place like a chain, wrapping around her soul, burning and freezing simultaneously, and she knew from the way Cailan rose from his throne with shock written across his features that he felt it too. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The guards had backed away instinctively, hands on their weapons, but clearly terrified of interfering with whatever supernatural force had transformed the hall into a vortex of elemental energy. Cailan descended the steps from his throne slowly, his movements predatory and cautious, and when he spoke his voice was like gravel and silk combined. He told her that he had been dreaming of her face for months, seeing her in visions that plagued his sleep and left him waking with a longing he could not name, and that his seers had warned him that an Omega marked by ancient power would either be his salvation or his complete destruction. He demanded to know what she was, what magic she carried, and why his wolf was howling inside him with recognition that defied logic. Arya, still reeling from the intensity of the bond and the flood of memories that were not quite hers yet, felt intimately familiar, met his gaze with a steadiness she did not feel, and told him that the wind had been whispering his name to her since childhood, that she had been marked by forces neither of them fully understood, and that if the legends were true, they had been destroying each other across lifetimes, because neither had learned what the curse was trying to teach them. She saw fury flash across his features at her words, saw his hands clench into fists as if he wanted to strike her for daring to speak of destiny and fate to a king who believed in nothing but power and control. But beneath the anger, she also saw fear, raw and vulnerable, the terror of a man who had built walls so high around his heart that the thought of them crumbling was more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. Cailan ordered her taken to the West Tower, to rooms that had been locked and unused for decades, and commanded that she be guarded but not harmed. As the soldiers dragged her away, she heard him call out one final order. His voice rough with emotions he refused to name. He told them that no one was to speak to the Omega prisoner, that she was to remain in isolation until he decided what to do with her, and that anyone who disobeyed would face execution. But as Arya was pulled through the doorway, she glanced back and caught him staring at her with an expression of such profound longing mixed with hatred that it stole the breath from her lungs. The wind whispered to her then, soft and sad, telling her that this version of Cailan had suffered more than any of his previous incarnations, that his heart had been shattered so many times by betrayal and loss that he had sealed it away completely, and that if she could not find a way to reach the man beneath the monster, this cycle would end as all the others had, in blood and tears, and the eternal continuation of their curse. The tower room was surprisingly luxurious, with tapestries depicting ancient forests and rivers that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of her eye, a massive bed covered in furs and silks, and windows that overlooked the entire kingdom spread below like a map of conquest. Arya discovered that the door was locked from the outside, but that she had access to a bathing chamber with heated water that ran through pipes in the walls, and shelves stocked with clothes far finer than anything she had ever owned. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating, and she spent the first night pacing its confines while the wind rattled the windows and filled her mind with fragments of memories that belonged to other versions of herself. She saw Ariandel the sorceress standing in this very tower, felt the ghost of her love for the first Alpha King and the agony of his betrayal when he chose power over their bond. She witnessed 6 other lifetimes flash past like pages in a book, each one showing a different Arya, meeting a different Kaelin, each one ending in tragedy. In one life, she had been executed for witchcraft when her powers manifested during their mating ceremony. In another, he had rejected the bond publicly and taken a chosen mate of pure Alpha bloodline, driving her to madness and eventual suicide. In yet another, they had tried to make it work, had even produced children, but his inability to trust and her inability to forgive had poisoned everything until war between their kingdoms had forced them to opposite sides of a battlefield where he had killed her with his own hands. Each death had fractured both their souls a little more. Each rebirth had made them harder and more damaged, until this current iteration seemed destined to be the final one, the breaking point where the curse would either be lifted or would consume them both completely. When Kaelin finally came to her 3 days later, he did not announce himself, but simply appeared in her room at midnight, moving with the silence of a predator that had learned to walk among enemies. Arya had been standing at the window watching the northern lights dance across the sky when she felt his presence, and she turned slowly to find him leaning against the doorframe with an expression that was equal parts hunger and resentment. He was dressed simply in black leather and linen, without the crown and formal robes he wore in public, and in this more vulnerable state she could see the scars that covered his forearms and the exhaustion that lived in his eyes. He told her that his seers had confirmed what she claimed, that they were indeed bound by an ancient curse that had followed them through 7 lifetimes, and that according to prophecy, this would be their last chance to break the cycle before both their souls were destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption or rebirth. He said this flatly, without emotion, as if discussing military strategy rather than eternal damnation. But Arya could see the white-knuckled grip he had on the doorframe, and knew that he was barely holding himself together. She asked him quietly what he intended to do with this knowledge, whether he planned to reject the bond again as he had in other lives, or whether some part of him was willing to consider that perhaps the curse existed because the original Ariandel had been trying to teach her Alpha what real love required. Her words hit him like physical blows, and she watched him flinch, saw rage and pain war across his features before he moved toward her with frightening speed and backed her against the window with his body caging hers. His scent overwhelmed her senses, pine and snow, and something wild that called to every Omega instinct she possessed. And when he lowered his face to her neck and breathed her in, she felt her knees weaken despite her determination to remain strong. Kaelin growled low in his chest, the sound reverberating through both their bodies, and told her that he could feel the bond burning between them like a living thing, that every instinct screamed at him to claim her immediately and bind her to him in every way possible, but that he had learned through decades of brutal lessons that desire and destiny were traps that destroyed everything he touched. He said that everyone he had ever cared for had either betrayed him or been taken from him, that his first mate had been murdered by rival alphas who wanted to weaken his rule, that his closest friend had sold kingdom secrets to enemies in exchange for gold, and that even his own father had tried to poison him to maintain power past his natural reign. Arya listened to this litany of pain, and understood that Kaelin had not become cruel through choice, but through necessity, that he had built his walls not from arrogance, but from the desperate need to survive in a world that had shown him nothing but violence and treachery. When he finally pulled back to look at her, she saw moisture in his eyes that he refused to acknowledge, and she made a decision that terrified her even as it felt cosmically right. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder beneath her palm, and told him that she would not beg him to accept the bond, would not plead for his affection, or promise him that she was different from those who had hurt him. Instead, she would give him something no one else ever had. She would give him the truth without manipulation, her presence without demands, and time too. Decide what he truly wanted without pressure or ultimatums. She said that the curse could only be broken if he chose her freely, not from obligation or lust, but from genuine love that grew from trust and respect, and that she would rather die free than live as a mate he resented. Her words seemed to shake something loose inside him, and for the first time since she had met him, Kaelin looked at her not as a threat or a prize, but as a person. He stepped back, putting distance between them, though she could see what the separation cost him, and told her that he would not keep her locked in the tower like some fairy tale prisoner. He said that if they were truly going to explore whether this bond was worth salvaging, or if they should find a way to break it and end the cycle permanently, then she needed to see exactly who he was and what his rule entailed. Starting the next day, she would have freedom to move throughout the palace and grounds, though guards would accompany her for her own protection, and she would attend court sessions and council meetings so that she could witness firsthand the kind of king he had become. He warned her that what she would see might kill whatever fragile hope she was nurturing, that his methods were harsh and his judgments often brutal, but that he would not lie to her or pretend to be something he was not. Arya agreed to these terms, knowing that she needed to see all of him, both the monster and the man, before she could determine if the person the wind had promised her still existed somewhere beneath the armor he wore. The following weeks were a revelation in the truest sense, an unveiling of realities that challenged everything Arya thought she understood about power and justice. She watched Kaelin rule his kingdom with iron discipline, saw him sentence thieves to brutal punishments and order executions for crimes that seemed to warrant mercy, witnessed him reject pleas from villages suffering from famine because they had not met their tribute quotas. But she also saw the context that his subjects did not. She learned that the harsh punishments were often the only thing preventing complete anarchy in a kingdom where neighboring realms constantly tested their borders and internal factions plotted rebellion. She discovered that the rejected villages had been hoarding grain to sell on black markets while lying about shortages, and that Kaelin's spies had uncovered the deception. She witnessed him personally training young soldiers with a dedication that spoke of someone who understood the value of every life he sent into battle, and she saw him sit vigil all night with a dying warrior who had served his father, holding the man's hand and promising to care for his family. The contradictions were maddening. He could be absolutely ruthless one moment and unexpectedly tender the next, could order a corrupt noble publicly flogged, and then personally deliver food to the man's innocent children. Arya began to understand that Kaelin had not simply chosen cruelty, but had developed a complex system of justice that prioritized the survival and stability of the many over the comfort of the few, and that every harsh decision haunted him, even as he refused to show weakness by second-guessing himself publicly. Press the like button if you are captivated by this complex alpha king who is so much more than he appears, and share your thoughts on whether strict justice or merciful compassion makes a better ruler. Their personal interactions during this time were careful and charged with tension that had nothing to do with anger. Kaelin would seek her out in the evenings, appearing in the library where she had taken to reading ancient texts about elemental magic, or joining her in the gardens where she sat listening to the wind. They began to talk, really talk, about things that mattered beyond the surface pleasantries of court. He told her about the weight of wearing a crown that had been passed down through bloodlines soaked in violence, about the impossibility of trusting anyone when betrayal was the common language of politics, and about the dreams that still haunted him of a life where he could be something other than a weapon shaped by circumstance. Arya shared her own stories, about growing up as an Omega, in a world that saw her designation as weakness, about the isolation of hearing voices others could not and being marked as different, and about the strange comfort she found in the wind's constant presence even when its messages terrified her. She also began teaching him about the old magic that ran through her veins, showing him how she could call gentle breezes or summon devastating storms depending on her emotional state, and explaining that the power was not hers to control, but rather something she had to work in harmony with. Kaelin was fascinated by this, by the idea of power that required cooperation rather than domination, and she saw him beginning to question some of the fundamental assumptions that had governed his rule. The turning point came during a council meeting where a group of nobles proposed a law that would strip Omegas of the right to own property independently, arguing that such ownership created instability when Omegas could not be trusted to manage resources wisely. Arya sat in her designated chair, required to remain silent as a non-council member, and watched Kaelin's face as the arguments were made. She saw him considering the proposal with the same cold calculation he applied to all political matters, weighing the benefits of appeasing these powerful nobles against the abstract principle of fairness. And she felt her heart sink as she realized he was actually going to approve it. But then something unexpected happened. One of the younger nobles, a woman named Sarah, who had always been kind to Arya, stood and challenged the proposal with a passionate speech about how Omegas had proven themselves capable of managing estates and businesses throughout the kingdom's history, and how this law was nothing more than a power grab by alphas who feared losing control. The senior nobles laughed at her, dismissing her arguments as emotional naivety, and Kaelin raised his hand to end the discussion and call for a vote. But before he could speak, the wind in the council chamber began to rise, swirling around Arya with visible force that made papers fly from the table and candles gutter. She was not consciously controlling it, but her anger and disappointment were feeding the magic, and everyone in the room felt the temperature drop as frost began forming on the windows, despite it being midsummer. Kaelin's eyes locked onto hers across the chamber, and she saw the exact moment when understanding dawned. He was seeing himself through her eyes, seeing what he had become and what he was about to do, and the shame that crossed his features was devastating in its rawness. He stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority, and declared that not only would the proposed law be rejected, but that he would be reviewing all existing legislation regarding Omega rights to ensure that his kingdom was not built on systemic oppression, disguised as tradition. The nobles erupted in protest, several threatening to withdraw their support if he insisted on this radical course. But Kaelin silenced them with a look that promised consequences for any who challenged his decree. He said that a king who required the subjugation of half his population to maintain power was no true leader, but merely a tyrant propped up by fear, and that if they could not accept his vision for a more equitable kingdom, they were welcome to take their concerns directly to him in the training yard, where he would be happy to discuss the matter with steel instead of words. The threat was clear, and the nobles subsided, though Arya could see the calculations in their eyes, and knew that this decision had made Kaelin powerful enemies among his own court. After the council dispersed, he came to her and did something she had never seen him do with anyone. He apologized. He told her that watching her magic respond to her pain had forced him to confront how much of his rule was based on maintaining the same kinds of hierarchies that had damaged him, and that if he truly wanted to break the cycle of their curse, he had to be willing to break the cycles of oppression that his kingdom was founded upon. It was not a grand romantic gesture, but a quiet acknowledgement of fault, and it meant more to Arya than any declaration of love could have. From that day forward, Kaelin began to change in ways that rippled throughout the kingdom. He established a council of Omegas to advise on policies that affected them directly, shocking the court by actually implementing their suggestions even when they contradicted noble preferences. He revised the justice system to include consideration of circumstances and intent, rather than applying brutal punishments universally, creating a framework that was still firm, but no longer needlessly cruel. He opened the palace training grounds to any who wished to learn combat skills, regardless of designation, arguing that a kingdom was stronger when all its citizens could defend themselves and their communities. Each reform was met with resistance from those who benefited from the old ways, and Arya watched him navigate these challenges with a combination of strategic compromise and unbending principle that revealed the leader he could have always been if he had not been so consumed by fear and trauma. But the changes also made him vulnerable in ways he had not been before, and his enemies began plotting to exploit that vulnerability. Rumors spread through the kingdom that the Alpha King had been bewitched by an Omega witch, that his mind had been compromised by dark magic, and that he was leading them toward ruin by abandoning the strong traditions that had kept the Northern Kingdom dominant for generations. Arya knew these whispers were being deliberately cultivated by nobles who wanted Kaelin removed from power, and she tried to warn him that his reforms needed to be implemented more slowly to avoid giving his enemies ammunition for a coup. But Kaelin, having finally found a purpose beyond mere survival, refused to slow down. He told her that he had wasted too many lifetimes already, both literally through their curse, and figuratively through decades of maintaining a system he now recognized as fundamentally unjust, and that if his enemies wanted to challenge him, he would meet them head-on, rather than cowering to preserve a peace built on oppression. Arya saw the determination in his eyes, and recognized it as both his greatest strength and his most dangerous flaw. This tendency to charge forward once he had committed to a course of action without considering the consequences. She also saw something else, something that made her breath catch and her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. She saw that he was looking at her differently now, not with the wary hunger of those first encounters, but with a softness that spoke of genuine affection growing beneath the physical attraction. When he touched her, which was becoming more frequent, his hands lingered with a tenderness that contradicted his brutal reputation, and when he smiled at something she said, the expression transformed his entire face into someone younger and less burdened. She was falling in love with him, not with the idea of him that the wind had promised, but with the real man who was struggling to become better, despite all the forces pulling him backward. And she suspected that he was falling just as helplessly for her. The confession came on a night when the northern lights were particularly vivid, painting the sky in shades of emerald and violet that seemed to dance to music only the stars could hear. They were in the tower room that had become their unofficial sanctuary, sharing wine and conversation in front of the fireplace while the wind howled outside with unusual intensity. Kaylin had been telling her about his childhood, about a mother who had died giving birth to him, and a father who had blamed him for that loss every day of his life, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression so raw it hurt to witness. He told her that he had been dreaming again, but these dreams were different from the visions that had plagued him before she arrived. In these new dreams, he saw potential futures rather than painful pasts, saw versions of their life together where they ruled side by side with wisdom and compassion, where they broke the curse not through grand magical gestures, but through the daily choice to be better than their previous incarnations. He said that for the first time in his entire existence, spanning multiple lifetimes, he was only now beginning to remember. He felt something other than rage and emptiness. He felt hope, and it terrified him more than any enemy army ever had, because hope meant having something to lose, and he had built his entire identity around being someone who could not be destroyed because he had nothing left that mattered. But now he had her, and the thought of failing her, of repeating the mistakes that had damned them both across centuries, was almost paralyzing in its intensity. Arya listened to this confession with tears streaming down her face, understanding the courage it required for someone like Kaylin to admit vulnerability, and she made her own confession in return. She told him that she loved him, not because the wind had promised they were fated, not because of some mystical bond that tied their souls together, but because of who he was choosing to become, despite how much easier it would be to remain the monster everyone expected. She loved him for his strength and his scars, for his terrible decisions and his attempts to make amends, for the way he listened when she spoke, even when her words challenged everything he believed, and for the glimpses she caught of the man he could have been if the world had been kinder to him. Subscribe to our channel if you want to see how this epic love story unfolds, and whether these cursed souls can finally find their happy ending across the barriers of time and fate. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the claiming kiss that Omega romance novels described, nothing like the violent possession that might have been expected from an alpha king with his reputation. Instead, it was tender and questioning, a request rather than a demand, and when she kissed him back with all the longing she had been suppressing for weeks, she felt the bond between them surge to life with an intensity that made the room glow with ethereal light. The mating marks that had been dormant on both their bodies began to burn, ancient symbols writing themselves across their skin in patterns that matched perfectly when they aligned their wrists together. And through their connection, Arya felt the rush of his emotions. Love and fear and desperate hope all tangled together in a knot that threatened to choke them both. They made love that night, with a passion that transcended the physical, their bodies moving together as if choreographed by muscle memory from lifetimes past. And when Kaylin finally claimed her in the way of their kind, sinking his teeth into the traditional mating spot where her neck met her shoulder, Arya felt 7 lifetimes worth of loneliness and pain begin to heal. But she also felt something else, a dark presence stirring at the edges of their consciousness, and she realized with growing horror that completing the bond had triggered the final phase of the curse. If they could not prove within the next lunar cycle that their love was genuine and that Kaylin had truly changed, the curse would consume them both and destroy everything they had built. And this time there would be no rebirth, no second chances, only the complete annihilation of both their souls. The attack came 3 days after their mating, swift and coordinated in a way that spoke of careful planning and inside information. Assassins breached the palace during the changing of the guard, moving through corridors with knowledge of patrol routes and blind spots that could only have come from someone within Kaelin's inner circle. Arya woke to the sound of steel on steel, and Kaelin's roar of fury as he fought off intruders in their bedchamber, his body positioned protectively between her and the masked figures that had somehow penetrated his personal quarters. She watched him fight with a savagery that reminded her why he had survived as king in a world that constantly challenged his right to the throne, watched him kill 3 trained assassins with nothing but a ceremonial dagger and his bare hands. But she also saw the moment when a poisoned blade grazed his shoulder and his movements began to slow. The wind screamed through the shattered window, responding to her panic, and she felt her power surge in ways it never had before. The air in the room became a weapon, solidifying into blades that cut down the remaining attackers, and then dispersing into a barrier that sealed the doorway against reinforcements. Kaelin stared at her with shock and something like awe as she stood there glowing with elemental magic, her hair whipping around, her face and her eyes reflecting the storm she had called, and she realized that she had just revealed the full extent of her power to witnesses who would spread the tale throughout the kingdom. The secret of what she truly was could no longer be contained. The investigation into the assassination attempt revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Kaelin's government. 5 senior nobles had orchestrated the attack, funded by neighboring kingdoms who feared that a reformed northern kingdom would be more dangerous than the brutal but predictable regime they had learned to navigate. The traitors had planned to kill both Kaelin and Arya, install a puppet king from a minor branch of the royal bloodline, and return the kingdom to its old ways while enriching themselves through deals with foreign powers. When the conspirators were brought before the court in chains, the old Kaelin would have had them executed immediately and brutally, making examples that would terrify anyone else who considered betrayal. Arya watched him struggle with this instinct, watched him war between the learned response of overwhelming violence and the newer understanding that true strength sometimes meant choosing a different path. In the end, he made a decision that shocked everyone present. He stripped the traitors of their titles and lands, distributed their holdings among those who had proven loyal and those who had been oppressed under the old system, and then gave the Sioux conspirators a choice. They could accept exile to a distant region where they would live as common citizens under supervision, required to work for their survival and contribute to the communities they had once exploited, or they could choose trial by combat where they would face him personally. Every single one of them chose exile, preferring uncertain survival to certain death, and Kaelin told them that if they ever returned or plotted against his kingdom again, there would be no mercy and no second chances. It was a punishment that served multiple purposes, removing threats while avoiding the creation of martyrs, demonstrating both strength and unusual mercy, and sending a message that the Alpha King's justice had evolved beyond simple brutality. But the assassination attempt and the revealed conspiracy had consequences that extended beyond court politics. The common people, who had heard exaggerated tales of the Omega Witch, who commanded storms and had enchanted their king, were divided in their response. Some saw Arya as a savior, who had protected Kaelin when his own guards failed, proof that the bond between them was blessed by ancient powers and meant to strengthen the kingdom. Others believed the rumors that she was a dark sorceress who had corrupted their once fearsome king, turning him weak with talk of reforms and equality, leading them toward destruction disguised as progress. Tensions escalated until there were protests in the streets, some demanding that Arya be crowned as their queen and given official power to continue the reforms, others insisting that she be tried for witchcraft and executed before she could doom them all. Kaelin addressed these divisions by doing something unprecedented in the Northern Kingdom's history. He called a gathering of all free citizens, not just nobles and landowners, and spoke to them directly about his intentions and his vision for their future. He stood before thousands and told them the truth about the curse that had followed him through multiple lifetimes, about the bond he shared with Arya and what it represented, and about his own failures as a leader who had prioritized strength over wisdom for too long. He said that he understood their fear of change, because he had lived in that fear himself, but that fear was a poor foundation for any kingdom that hoped to endure beyond the lifetime of a single ruler. He promised them that the reforms would continue, but that their voices would be heard in this process, that councils would be established in every region to allow citizens to participate in governance, and that any policy that affected them directly would be subject to their input before being implemented. It was a radical restructuring of power that made his remaining nobles furious and made the common people cautiously hopeful. Arya watched this transformation with pride and growing concern, because she could feel through their bond that the curse was not satisfied with political reforms alone. The wind whispered to her constantly now, urgent and insistent, telling her that the final test was approaching and that it would require a sacrifice neither of them had anticipated. She began having visions of her own, seeing the original Ariandel standing at a crossroads with the first Alpha King, watching as that ancient version of herself made a choice that had doomed all their future incarnations. The original curse had been born, not from simple betrayal, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of what their bond was meant to accomplish. Ariandel had wanted to be chosen above all else, had demanded that her Alpha prove his love by abandoning his duties and running away with her, but he had refused, believing that his responsibility to his people had to come first, even if it meant losing his personal happiness. Neither had been entirely wrong, but neither had been completely right either, and their inability to find a middle path had created the curse that punished them for choosing extremes. Now in this final incarnation, Arya and Kaelin were being tested to see if they could succeed where all their previous versions had failed. Could they love each other completely while also loving their kingdom and their people? Could they be partners who strengthened rather than diminished each other? Could they prove that personal bonds and public duty were not mutually exclusive, but actually interdependent when approached with wisdom and balance? The answer came during the lunar eclipse that marked the end of their testing period, when the curse would either break or consume them. A foreign army, taking advantage of the internal turmoil and sensing weakness in Kaelin's reforms, invaded from the eastern border with overwhelming numbers and advanced weaponry. Kaelin had to make an impossible choice. He could stay at the capital to protect Arya and complete the mating bond ceremony that might break the curse, or he could lead his armies personally to defend the villages that would be slaughtered if he delayed. The old Kaelin would have chosen war without hesitation, would have prioritized his kingdom over any personal attachment. But that choice was what had damned him in the original timeline. Yet choosing Arya over his people would be equally wrong, would validate all the criticisms that his enemies had leveled against him, and would result in deaths that his conscience could never forgive. Arya saw him struggling with this decision, saw the torment in his eyes as he looked at her, knowing that making the right choice might mean losing her forever. And she made the decision for both of them. She told him that she would ride with him to war, that her elemental magic could turn the tide of battle in ways traditional forces could not, and that the bond between them was not some fragile thing that required perfect ritual conditions, but something that had survived 7 lifetimes of suffering and could withstand whatever trials remained. She said that if the curse demanded they choose between love and duty, then they would prove the curse wrong by refusing to accept that false dichotomy. They would choose both, would fight for their people together, and would trust that their bond was strong enough to endure whatever consequences followed. Leave a comment below sharing whether you would make the same choice, or if you think they should have prioritized completing the ceremony, and tell us what you think will happen when they face this army together. The battle that followed would be remembered in Northern Kingdom history as the Turning of the Wind, when the Omega Queen, who was not yet officially crowned, rode beside her Alpha King and changed the face of warfare forever. Arya did not fight with sword or spear, but with the elements themselves, calling winds that disoriented enemy formations and protected allied troops, summoning fog that concealed strategic movements and revealed enemy ambushes, and, in moments of desperate need, unleashing lightning that struck with surgical precision against siege equipment and command positions. But she also did something more important than any tactical advantage her magic provided. She moved among the wounded after each skirmish, using her connection to nature to identify healing herbs and clean water sources, organizing civilians to create field hospitals and supply lines, and demonstrating through her actions that strength was not only about destruction, but also about preservation and care. The soldiers who had been skeptical of their king's Omega mate saw her working tirelessly alongside healers and common citizens, saw her risk her own safety to drag wounded fighters from the battlefield, and began to understand what Kaelin had been trying to tell them about different kinds of power. Meanwhile, Kaelin fought with the strategic brilliance that had made him legendary, but also with a new restraint that sought to minimize casualties. On both sides, he sent offers of honorable surrender to enemy commanders, promising fair treatment for those who laid down arms, and warning that those who continued fighting would face his full fury. Many accepted, unwilling to die for a war that their own rulers had started based on miscalculated assumptions about Northern Kingdom weakness. The final confrontation came on the third day of battle, when the enemy's supreme commander, an alpha warlord named Ravok, who had built his reputation on crushing smaller kingdoms, challenged Kaelin to single combat to decide the war's outcome. It was a traditional challenge that could not be refused without dishonor, and Arya felt ice in her veins as she watched Kaelin accept, despite being exhausted from days of constant fighting. The duel took place in a clearing between the armies with thousands watching from both sides, and it was brutal in its intensity. Ravok was younger and fresher, armed with enchanted weapons that had tasted the blood of dozens of defeated kings, but Kaelin fought with the skill of someone who had been training for combat across multiple lifetimes. They circled each other like wolves, trading blows that would have killed lesser fighters, and Arya felt every wound Kaelin took as if it were her own through their bond. She wanted to intervene, wanted to use her magic to tip the balance, but she knew that doing so would invalidate the duel and damn Kaelin in the eyes of both armies. All she could do was stand with, her hands clenched and her heart breaking, feeling the curse stirring at the edges of reality, waiting to see if this would be the moment they finally failed. Then something unexpected happened. Kaelin had Ravok disarmed and at his mercy, sword at the warlord's throat and victory within his grasp when he stopped. Instead of delivering the killing blow that everyone expected, he offered Ravok his hand and a choice. He said that enough blood had been spilled in this war that neither side had truly wanted, that Ravok's skill and honor in combat had earned respect rather than death, and that if the warlord would agree to peace and withdraw his forces, Kaelin would consider him a potential ally rather than a defeated enemy. The clearing went absolutely silent. Warriors from both sides stared in disbelief at this unprecedented show of mercy from a king known for his ruthlessness, and Arya felt the curse shudder around them, confused by this deviation from expected patterns. Ravok looked at Kaelin's extended hand for a long moment, searching for deception or weakness, and found instead something he had not expected to see in an enemy's eyes. He found genuine respect and the offer of dignity rather than humiliation. Slowly, testing whether this was truly real, Ravok accepted the hand and allowed Kaelin to pull him to his feet. The warlord told his armies to stand down, declared that the Northern Kingdom had proven itself worthy of peace rather than conquest, and swore an oath that he would not raise arms against Kaelin again unless provoked by betrayal. The two armies, released from the tension of combat, erupted in cheers that echoed across the battlefield, and Arya felt the curse around them begin to crack like ice under spring sun. This was what had been missing in every previous lifetime. Not grand romantic gestures or magical rituals, but the fundamental understanding that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to extend mercy. That real leadership required wisdom to see beyond immediate victory to lasting peace, and that love was not about choosing between personal bonds and public duty, but about allowing each to strengthen the other. When Kaelin returned to her side, bloodied but alive, she threw herself into his arms and felt the final pieces of the curse shatter completely. The mating marks on their skin blazed with light that was visible even in daylight, ancient symbols rearranging themselves into new patterns that represented not a curse but a blessing, a bond that had been tested across 7 lifetimes and had finally proven itself unbreakable. The journey back to the capital was triumphant, with citizens lining the roads to cheer for their king and the Omega who had fought beside him. But Arya and Kaelin barely noticed the celebration, because they were too focused on each other, and on the profound changes they could feel happening within themselves. Memories from all 7 lifetimes were integrating into their consciousness, not as separate experiences, but as parts of a continuous whole. and they began to understand the full scope of what they had endured and overcome. They remembered every death, every betrayal, every moment of pain, but they also remembered every genuine moment of love, every small kindness that had survived even in their worst incarnations, and every lesson learned through suffering that had prepared them for this final chance at happiness. The curse had not been merely a punishment, but also a teaching tool, brutal and unforgiving, but ultimately aimed at forcing both souls to evolve beyond the limitations that had damned them originally. Now, with the curse broken, they were free to build the life together that had always been possible but never achieved, and they intended to make the most of that freedom. The coronation ceremony, where Arya was officially named Queen of the Northern Kingdom, was unlike any the realm had witnessed before. Kaelin had insisted on changes to the traditional ritual that recognized her not as a consort, whose power derived from his, but as a co-ruler, whose authority was equal and independently granted. They stood together before assembled nobles and commoners alike, before representatives from neighboring kingdoms including Ravok, who had become an unexpected ally, and took oaths that bound them not just to each other, but to the principles they had fought to establish. They swore to rule with justice, tempered by mercy, to protect the weak without enabling tyranny, to honor tradition without being enslaved by it, and to remember always that their power was granted by the people they served and could be revoked if they failed in their duties. The ceremony included elements from ancient Omega traditions that had been suppressed for generations, weaving wind magic and elemental blessings into the formal proceedings. And when Arya called the winds to carry their oaths across the entire kingdom, so that even those who could not attend would hear their promises, there was not a single person present who doubted that they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. The reforms that followed were comprehensive and sometimes painful, requiring the dismantling of systems that had existed for centuries and the creation of new structures that would serve all citizens, regardless of designation or birth status. Arya took personal responsibility for establishing schools where Omegas could learn trades and professions beyond traditional domestic roles, creating legal protections against discrimination and abuse, and building networks of support for those who had been marginalized under the old regime. Kaelin focused on reforming the military and justice systems, eliminating the most brutal practices while maintaining the discipline necessary for national security, establishing transparent processes for addressing grievances, and creating pathways for social mobility based on merit rather than bloodline. They worked together on economic policies that reduced the concentration of wealth among noble families and created opportunities for common citizens to build prosperous lives through honest work. Not everyone was happy with these changes, and there were moments when resistance threatened to undo all their progress. But Arya and Kaelin had learned through their trials that meaningful change required persistent effort and willingness to weather opposition without abandoning core principles. They supported each other through the difficult decisions and celebrated together when their policies began showing positive results in improved living conditions and greater social stability. Their personal life together was equally transformative. The bond between them had deepened into something that went beyond the mystical connection of fated mates, becoming a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine friendship that coexisted with passionate love. They learned each other's rhythms and patterns, discovered how to navigate conflicts without damaging their relationship, and created spaces where each could maintain individual identity while also functioning as a united team. Kaelin's tendency toward controlling behavior gradually softened as he learned to trust Arya's judgment and capabilities, and Arya's occasional retreat into isolation when overwhelmed was balanced by Kaelin's patient persistence in drawing her back into connection. They were not perfect, and their relationship was not without challenges, but they had both lived through enough lifetimes of failure to appreciate what they had built together and to fight for it when difficulties arose. The wind that had once whispered warnings and prophecies to Arya changed its song, becoming a constant gentle presence that celebrated their happiness and reminded them of how far they had come. When Arya discovered she was pregnant with their first child, the joy was tempered with an understanding of how precious and significant this moment truly was. In previous lifetimes, they had never progressed far enough in their relationship to create new life together, the curse always ensuring destruction before such possibilities could manifest. Now, carrying a child that represented the future they had fought across centuries to achieve. Arya felt the weight of responsibility and the profound gift of hope in equal measure. Kaelin was overwhelming in his attentiveness, his protectiveness reaching comical levels, until Arya had to firmly remind him that pregnancy was not an illness, and that she was still perfectly capable of managing her duties as queen. But beneath his excessive concern, she understood the fear that drove it, the terror that somehow they might still lose everything they had built. And she loved him even more for his vulnerability. They prepared for their child's arrival together, not just in practical ways, but in ensuring that the kingdom they would inherit would be worthy of the sacrifice and struggle that had made its existence possible. If this story of love that conquered time itself has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another tale of supernatural romance and epic transformation. The birth of their daughter during a night when the northern lights painted the sky in colors never before witnessed was celebrated throughout the kingdom as a sign of blessing from the ancient powers. They named her Ariel, combining syllables from both their names as a reminder that she was the product of their union, and the living symbol of the curses breaking. She had her mother's dark hair, and her father's ice-blue eyes, and from her first breath, the wind responded to her presence with gentle caresses that suggested she had inherited Arya's elemental gifts. Holding his daughter for the first time, Kaelin wept openly with an emotion too complex for words, mourning all the lifetimes he had lost and celebrating the one he had finally claimed. Arya watched her mate, her partner, her king, cradle their child with a tenderness that transformed his entire being, and knew that the man the wind had promised her had always existed, had always been waiting beneath the armor and scars for someone who could see him clearly enough to help him find himself. Their family grew over the years that followed, 3 more children joining Ariel, each one unique and precious, each one raised in a kingdom that valued them for who they were, rather than trying to force them into rigid hierarchies of designation and blood. The Northern Kingdom, under their joint rule, became a beacon that inspired changes throughout the entire region. Other realms, seeing the prosperity and stability that resulted from more equitable governance and the integration of different types of power, began implementing their own reforms. Ravok, who had remained an ally and friend, returned to his own lands and transformed his warlord holdings into a principality that emphasized education and trade over constant military expansion. Neighboring kingdoms that had once been enemies became trading partners, and eventually close allies, creating a network of relationships that brought unprecedented peace to a region that had known primarily war for generations. Arya and Kaelin were not naive enough to believe that all conflicts had been eliminated, or that human nature had fundamentally changed, but they had proven that different approaches were possible, and that cycles of violence and oppression could be broken when leaders had the courage to try. The wind that had guided Arya since childhood eventually grew quieter, its urgent messages no longer necessary, now that the destinies it had been trying to shape had been fulfilled. But it never completely left, remaining as a gentle presence that reminded her of where she had come from and what she had overcome. Years later, when Kaelin and Arya were older and their children were grown with families of their own, they stood together on the tower balcony where so much of their early relationship had unfolded. The wind was particularly active that evening, swirling around them with playful energy, and Arya laughed as it tangled her now silver-streaked hair. Kaelin pulled her close, his body still strong despite the years, but marked with the scars of a long life fully lived, and told her that if he had to live 7 lifetimes of suffering to reach this moment, he would gladly do it again. Arya turned in his arms and kissed him with the same passion that had burned between them since that first explosive meeting, and told him that she was grateful they would never have to, that this lifetime would extend into whatever came after, because they had finally learned what the curse had been trying to teach them all along. Love was not about possession, or grand gestures, or choosing between competing goods. Love was about seeing another person completely, accepting all their flaws and celebrating all their strengths, supporting their growth even when it was uncomfortable, and building something together that was greater than either could achieve alone. It was about balance between passion and wisdom, between personal desires and communal responsibilities, between holding on and letting go. The wind whispered around them one final time, carrying a message that sounded like approval and farewell, and then it settled into the gentle breeze of an ordinary evening, its work finally complete. Their story became legend in the Northern Kingdom and beyond, told and retold through generations as a reminder that some loves are worth fighting for across time itself, that curses can be broken by those brave enough to change, and that the most powerful magic is not found in spells or ancient rituals, but in the daily choice to be better than fear and trauma would allow. Children grew up hearing about the Omega Queen who commanded storms and the Alpha King who learned that true strength required vulnerability, about the bond that survived 7 lifetimes of suffering to finally find peace, and about the kingdom that transformed itself because 2 people refused to accept that destiny was fixed and unchangeable. The wind still sometimes whispers their names to those who know how to listen, telling the tale of Arya and Kaelin, of love that conquered death and time and the darkest parts of the human soul, of redemption earned through persistent effort rather than granted through divine intervention, and of the simple, profound truth that we are all capable of breaking the